Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is one of the most interesting examples of a story being rewritten in the popular consciousness through adaptation. As I said in that previous video, a lot of people are surprised when they read classics because they're so different than what they're expecting, because we're more familiar with adaptations and archetypes of the story that have since changed it. What makes Jekyll and Hyde so interesting is that this change feels almost necessary for the story to survive. A few months ago, Babity Kate made a video talking about how nobody today will ever experience Treasure Island the same way that people did when it first came out. Because it's meant to be a surprise that Long John Silver is a pirate in the story, but the popularity of that story made him the blueprint for how pirates would be depicted for the next 100 years. So when you meet him in the story and he talks like a pirate, looks like a pirate, and has a parrot, and also is named Long John Silver, you will already be expecting him to be a pirate. Now, Long John Silver's reveal as a pirate is an important aspect to the story, but there's a lot more to it than that. So the fact that we have cultural knowledge about it doesn't affect our reading too extremely, unlike the experience reading The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Because the story is a gothic horror mystery, and spoilers, but the solution to that mystery is that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are the same person. Which, if you know one thing about this story, it's that. And that makes it very difficult to adapt faithfully. I mean, you can certainly enjoy stories that you know the ending of already. Romeo and Juliet tells you the ending at the very beginning of the play. But it can be a lot harder to do that when the story is a mystery expecting the audience to not know the end. The suspense and horror are primarily built around you not knowing that Jekyll and Hyde are the same person. And that's not to say people don't enjoy the story as is. I just reread it for this video, and it was still a fun read. I mean, fun in like a gothic Victorian sense, I suppose. Although it's certainly not my favorite piece of Victorian or Gothic literature, and the main reason I find it interesting is because of like the literary analysis that goes into it and the adaptations that it's produced. Because as this comment says, most adaptations of Jekyll and Hyde completely miss the point of the novel. Most adaptations portray Jekyll and Hyde as being antagonistic towards each other. Jekyll is the good one and he doesn't like to do the evil things that Hyde makes his body do, and Hyde is the evil one and he wants to be in control all the time and not do the good things that Jekyll wants. Alternatively, you'll see many adaptations where the character is just an evil person who is pretending to be good. Basically somebody who appears to be Jekyll but is actually Hyde. And neither of these are the book version. At least not exactly. The book is a bit of a combination of the two. You see, Jekyll is an upstanding gentleman, but he has a lot of dark, evil urges. And instead of just trying to ignore those feelings, he creates a serum that allows him to transform physically so he can let out all of his evil urges and not ruin the reputation of Dr. Jekyll. Hyde is made out of like the evilness inside of him, but he wants to do the things that Hyde does. It's not really a good versus evil because Jekyll is not a good person. Jekyll isn't afraid of turning into Hyde because he does horrible things like kill people. He's afraid because his transformations start happening outside of his control. After a while, he's more and more worried that he'll never be Jekyll again. And he's really not antagonistic to Hyde, it's just that he's afraid of losing himself. In the end, when he knows he's going to transform into Hyde for a final time, he says it doesn't matter what happens to Hyde. Not that he needs to be stopped or is horrible or that Jekyll hated him. In fact, Jekyll was planning to leave everything to him. He simply just acknowledged that Hyde was someone separate from him. And what's interesting is after the final transformation, Hyde kills himself right before he's about to be caught by the main character, who, by the way, is not Jekyll and Hyde. We'll get into that in a second. But it's unclear whether Hyde kills himself because of guilt, which Jekyll never really seemed to express, shame, which Jekyll did seem to express, or fear of being caught/arrested. But either way, a very simple interpretation of the novella is that there is evil within all of us, and the more we give into it, the more it becomes who we are. And we're not simply good or evil, we are multifaceted people. The story is very often interpreted through a Freudian lens where Hyde is obviously the id, and Jekyll is the ego, and the superego is Victorian society, not Jekyll's conscience. And these kind of basic interpretations are often lost in these adaptations of Jekyll and Hyde that change like the intrinsic nature of their relationship, because it's really not a battle of good and evil or secretly being evil the whole time. It's more complicated than that and really more about trying to understand the depths of human personality. Speaking of which, I think it's important to make clear that Jekyll and Hyde do not have DID or any precursor concept to that. If you don't know what DID is, it's dissociative identity disorder, what used to be known as multiple personality disorder, although that is not an appropriate term for it now. Now, many adaptations of Jekyll and Hyde, especially those that are trying to tell a more modern version of the story, or perhaps a fantastical one, we'll have them be a person with what is essentially DID. And this is, in my opinion, the worst possible way to do Jekyll and Hyde. Jekyll takes a serum to transform into Hyde and has to take another serum to transform back. It is a deliberate choice so he can go have some fun and be a bad boy without getting caught, and let out all of his urges without feeling shame. Later, it becomes an involuntary thing, but it is clearly still not a DID situation. He physically transforms into a different person. Jekyll and Hyde share a body, but they do not look the same, and the involuntary transformations are still only reversed through a serum. Adapting Jekyll and Hyde through a DID lens is not only playing into a very common way of misrepresenting people that have it, and missing the entire point of the book. It is a very unnecessary anachronistic change. Yet, unfortunately, I think it is a pretty common one to make. Although it is not the most popular change to the story, we're circling back to that protagonist now. As I said before, Jekyll and Hyde are not the protagonists. In fact, they are barely in the story. They are talked about often, but are rarely the ones actually being engaged with. And this is very important to our understanding of the novella, yet is probably the least likely aspect to be adapted. We don't experience Jekyll and Hyde having frequent transformations. We only find out about all of it in the end, because, again, it is a mystery. The story is told through the lens of Jekyll's lawyer and friend, Gabriel Utterson. And yes, Utterson is spelled like this. One of the largest themes of the book is the conflict between a public and private persona. The existence of Hyde creates a form of privacy for Jekyll so that he can do all kinds of little nasty things without it actually reflecting on him as a public figure. And this conflict of privacy is what Utterson really brings to the table. Victorian social standards are very strict, and most people will act differently in private. The private lives of these characters are complex and hard to understand because we don't get to see them often. The knowledge of something private about Jekyll is what instigates Utterson's curiosity in him. One day, Jekyll suddenly updates his will, leaving everything to this random creepy man named Hyde, and Utterson, being his lawyer, is the only one aware of this. That, along with Hyde giving a check from Jekyll's checkbook, are what connects the two of them, and it makes Jekyll a shadier character for having interactions with this creepy man, whose very existence is supposed to allow Jekyll to benefit from all of Victorian society. Personally, I think the most interesting way to read Jekyll and Hyde is that Hyde is Jekyll's queerness. This is a very popular reading of the novella, and honestly one that's hard not to see. I talked about the Labouchere Amendment before, but basically it was making it illegal to have any kind of gross indecency between men, which was a very vague, ambiguous term, which is a huge part of the interplay between public and private spheres, especially in regards to male relationships with each other. Which, if you read Jekyll and Hyde, you'll notice that pretty much all of the characters are men. Men who are pretty close to each other, and the way Jekyll talks about his vices and the shame he experiences from them is very similar to how someone might talk about being a gay or bisexual man. Especially around this time where male friendships were going through a very extreme change. And you can really notice this change in how Jekyll and Lanyon speak to each other. Jekyll feels the sort of kinship with Lanyon that used to be socially acceptable, but now is kind of seen as weird, because any interaction between two men could now theoretically be grounds for arrest. Personally, I think this is a very underutilized aspect of the story, and it should really be the direction more adaptations go in. Anyways, as I said at the beginning, I think Jekyll and Hyde really struggles to survive without some kind of changes to the original story, mostly because of the mystery being the most popular fact about it. But it is still interesting to read regardless, and we should be adapting more of the base themes of the story rather than changing the aspects that we end up doing. At least for the most part, in my opinion. There have been great adaptations of Jekyll and Hyde that I've seen. And thank you to everybody who commented or stitched this video talking about Jekyll and Hyde because it inspired me to reread the novella. And I recommend you do too if you're interested in the story, even after knowing all of this. Because you already know the most important spoiler. Hannah Montana is basically an inverted version of Jekyll and Hyde from the original story. Stories like Yu-Gi-Oh! Have two separate entities existing in the same body. And this is the direction a lot of adaptations tend to go in. But if you want to adapt the original concept for the character, Hannah Montana makes for a pretty good modern model. By which I specifically mean the characters of Hannah Montana and Miley Stewart. The overarching plot of both stories is obviously quite different. But Miley and Hannah have a very similar relationship to each other that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde do. And we can even see a parallel of sorts in how they interact with society. In both stories, they are effectively the same person, but able to transform into someone completely unrecognizable. Jekyll does this by taking a serum that changes his face, makes him shorter and hairier. And Miley does this by putting a wig on. And in both cases, it completely changes how they interact with the world and how the world interacts with them. Now, when I call Hannah Montana an inverted version of the character, what I mean is that Hannah Montana seems to resemble Dr. Jekyll, and Miley Stewart seems to resemble Mr. Hyde, despite the fact that we view Miley and Dr. Jekyll as the sort of base personality, with the other being their hidden identity. By this I mean they serve the same function in their relationship to society. The purpose of Jekyll's dual identity is so that he can do whatever he wants as Hyde, but still live under Victorian social norms as Jekyll. He gets to let out all of his urges in secret, whatever they may be, but still live as a respected scientist. Hyde gets to authentically indulge in his desires, and Jekyll gets to exist in society and have an upstanding social image. Because Victorian social norms are not only very strict, but are built on gossip and constantly being aware of other people's business. So Jekyll can't do all of the things he gets to do when he's Hyde. For Miley, the purpose of her dual identity is so that Hannah can live as a celebrity and Miley can live an ordinary life. Hannah obviously benefits from being a celebrity, but she is constantly under the public's eye. She has to act a certain way, even in private. And this is especially relevant to the story of Hannah Montana because it is aware of and criticizing paparazzi culture. A culture built on harassing and stalking celebrities, especially in the late 90s, early 2000s, and the constant performance you need to put on because of this paparazzi culture highly resembles the constant performance you have to put on for Victorian culture. In this way, Miley becomes the Hyde identity, giving her the opportunity to act authentically and do whatever she wants without the public scrutiny that she gets when she's Hannah. Hannah has to be a role model and idol for her fans, but Miley can do whatever she wants. Although being Hyde mentally affects Jekyll in some way, it's unclear whether this is a byproduct of the transformation or if it's because of how he feels when he gets to be a different person. Similarly, Miley and Hannah sometimes seem to have conflicting interests even though they are the same person, but how they're being treated in the moment of which identity they're being recognized as will affect how they think about the situation. Now, this kind of duality of alter egos existing in the same person exists in other forms of fiction as well, especially superheroes and their secret identities. For example, Peter Parker and Spider-Man are the same person, and you can see some similarities to the duality they have with Jekyll and Hyde. However, what makes Hannah Montana a particularly interesting example of the dual identities of one person is the reason for its existence and how it ends. Spider-Man, like many other superheroes, has a dual identity purely for altruistic reasons. He's doing it to protect his family and friends, because if the Green Goblin, for example, knew that Spider-Man was Peter Parker, then he could go after Peter Parker's family and friends. Preventing that is the importance of keeping a secret identity for a superhero. And in general, the reason the Spider-Man identity exists in the first place is to do altruistic, crime-fighting vigilante justice. Like, superheroes primarily exist to fight supervillains that other forms of law enforcement would not be able to handle. And this is very different than Jekyll and Hyde's dual identity. They exist specifically so that he can live both lives. There's no altruism involved, there's no one that needs to be saved. It's mainly just so that he can have a good time. And he could have a good reason for needing that time and that secrecy. Needing to live authentically is valid, but he's not doing it for anyone else. On the other hand, Hannah Montana arguably is saving her family from paparazzi, but they are often at these Hannah Montana events anyways. And they often have to deal with the ramifications of her life regardless. She keeps her lives separate for herself because if Miley were to ever merge into Hannah, she could no longer do a lot of the things that she likes to do. This is how she lives the best of both worlds. This is what makes it a particularly interesting comparison, along with the fact that in both examples their dual identity is unstable. Sometimes you're Hyde or Miley when you're not supposed to be. And in the end, both dual identities end up merging into one. The authentic, self-indulging Hyde and Miley ones specifically. Of course, for Jekyll, this isn't a choice. His transformations into Hyde become involuntary, and at some point it just becomes impossible for him to take serum to switch back. But Miley doesn't really have a choice either. Her publicly known boyfriend to Hannah Montana gets caught being with Miley Stewart, and the paparazzi assume that he's cheating. Even if she were to leave him because of this situation, her status as Miley Stewart is in jeopardy. It is too unstable to continue maintaining both identities, because they both exist in the world of Hannah now. just as Hyde signing a check with Jekyll's name on it intrinsically linked the two in the public sphere, and ultimately led to their secret being unmaintainable. And the fact that they both end up in the Hyde persona who engages with socially unacceptable behavior actually fits very well thematically. We can't escape our true selves, our actions, and our desires. Dual identities, secrets, are unmaintainable, but the one of you who is living more authentically is going to be the one that remains. But what makes Hannah Montana a nice modern model for this concept is its hopefulness. Hyde can't exist in Victorian society, not only because of the crimes he commits, but who he is as a person is unacceptable to them. And Jekyll is ashamed of that. Even though he enjoyed what he does as Hyde, he is ashamed of that part of himself. And when that part of himself is all that's left, he ends his life. You can't live happily under Victorian social norms, but you also can't live happily if you're being authentic, because you're no longer part of society. This is where Hannah Montana is a very hopeful alternative. Jekyll loses the base of who he is, and he becomes enraptured by a part of himself that he's ashamed of. But Miley gets to accept who she is and merge into her Hannah identity more gracefully. Hannah, the alter ego, is the one that disappears, and Miley remains. And at the very end of the show, she chooses to forego making a movie as her pop star self and live at college with her best friend. Despite living now in this celebrity paparazzi-filled world, she still gets to do what truly matters to her. In a comparative take between the two, it's like living authentically has become more socially accepted, to the point where we don't need dual identities anymore. And that is the wonder that Hannah Montana brings to the Jekyll and Hyde story. Now, obviously, Hannah Montana is not based on Jekyll and Hyde. This comment was just an apt comparison between the characters, specifically in how Jekyll and Hyde's identities are often misunderstood, and Hannah and Miley have a similar situation. But I thought it would be fun to run with it a bit and see just how far this comparison can go. I've been putting together the Jekyll and Hyde adaptations and comparisons that y'all have been commenting, and I'm planning on making a tier list of how they compare to the original novel. And I guess now Hannah Montana is going to be on that list because it makes for a pretty interesting comparison. Okay, I just watched Malignant, so let's talk about how it relates to Jekyll and Hyde. Obviously, spoilers ahead. But Malignant 2021 is a horror film which tells the story of this woman, Madison, who's been having a lot of miscarriages lately, and one day after getting into a fight with her husband, she has a vision of him getting murdered, and then she gets attacked by the person who murdered him. Or at least that's what seems to be happening. She then has more visions where she watches these people get murdered, but she's stuck in place and can't do anything. And they seem to be really far away from her. Come to find out, and here's the big spoiler, she has a parasitic twin who is conjoined in the brain at birth and is evil. Every time she gets pregnant, he's been absorbing the babies. And he can supernaturally take over her body where he controls her, but in reverse, where he's coming out the back of her head as a creepy brain man, and her body distorts backwards, and there's a supernatural element where the electricity goes wild, and he's super strong. And in the end, when he tries to attack her adoptive sister, she mentally overpowers him and takes over and locks him away to be dealt with at another time. In regards to how good the movie is, my partner and I had generally the same thoughts, which is that it borderlines on campy in an entertaining way. The dialogue and what's happening is so weird so often. One of the cops investigating the murders is excited whenever she sees a dead body. And they're really dramatic about certain lines that don't make sense to be, when she first revealed that she was adopted. It didn't really make sense for it to be this dramatic. And that was fun, but kind of in an unintentional way.
I could not get over the biological impossibility of all, because they tried to, you know what it was? If they had kept it spooky and supernatural, it would have been fine. But they tried to science explain it, and it was just such bad science that I can't even begin to think of that as real.
That is,
it made it too. It made it kind of hilarious.
Yeah. But on a positive note, some of the music choices are really good. It continuously plays the music from Fight Club to hint at the eventual reveal of Gabriel's existence. And I thought that was really cool. It also kind of had some interesting things to say. We both gave it a 3 out of 5. But now let's get into its connection to Jekyll and Hyde. Obviously, Madison is the Jekyll and Gabriel is the Hyde. However, the utilization of a Jekyll and Hyde trope here is much more in line with the modern adaptational view of the story. In fact, I think this makes for a very interesting baseline for like how this trope has evolved from the original Jekyll and Hyde. Both stories are like suspenseful, mystery, thriller-esque, but a key difference is that the protagonist of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is his friend Utterson, while in Malignant, the Jekyll character Madison is the protagonist. And in order to accommodate that change but keep it suspenseful, they make another huge change, which is that her and Gabriel are two separate entities and are not like aware at the same time, at least not until near the end. And like I said, this is kind of the modern trope that has evolved from the original Jekyll and Hyde story. Like, I don't think Malignant is intended to be an adaptation of Jekyll and Hyde, but I do think that it is utilizing a trope that was started by Stevenson but evolved over time. And in this modern usage of the trope, the Jekyll and Hyde characters are two separate entities, usually being good and evil, and are not conscious at the same time, or at the very least, the Jekyll character is not conscious when the Hyde character is. And like I said, in a story like Malignant, this is probably being done specifically because Madison is the main character. Jekyll already knows that he's also Hyde, and he primarily chooses to switch back and forth between them. So all of this suspense from the original novel is reliant on the protagonist being Utterson, somebody who doesn't already know. Even when the audience knows, it can still be an enjoyable read because the protagonist doesn't. And it's still unclear of what's happening exactly. So turning Jekyll into the main character requires some level of finagling in regards to this. Hence, two separate people who don't share memories. Now, with stories like Malignant that are utilizing this trope and not an actual adaptation of Jekyll and Hyde, I think it's fine to pit it as like good and evil, or at least like having an antagonistic relationship to each other and struggling to overcome the evil entity that's inside of you. But when it comes to actual adaptations of Jekyll and Hyde, I tend to find the good versus evil element to it obviously not being true to the source material, but I also don't think it's a great creative decision, at least in the way that I've seen it done. But who knows, maybe in this series I'll see some good uses of it. Anyway, something that I think was really interesting about Malignant specifically in regards to this Jekyll and Hyde conversation is how it differentiated itself from a DID narrative. Because as I said in my other video, this modern way of utilizing a Jekyll and Hyde trope often utilizes a pretty negative portrayal of DID, like the very common split personality evil alter ego trope, which is like one of the most common and inaccurate depictions of the disorder. Thankfully, I think most modern stories like this don't call it DID or split personality or multiple personality or anything like that. Some definitely do, but it's not the majority anymore. And Malignant kind of goes an extra step further where these two characters share a body, but they are actually separate beings. Not just like mentally separate personalities. They even control the body differently and look physically different when they are, which is reminiscent of the original story because the appearance change is like the main feature of the serum. Yeah, I thought it was a good way of not falling into that common harmful depiction. Anyways, so would I call Malignant a modern retelling of the original Jekyll and Hyde story? No, I would not. I would say it fits into a similar genre, but utilizes the modern adaptational trope. Still a pretty fun watch if you're interested in the kind of adaptational legacy of Jekyll and Hyde, because even if it's unintentional, there are still many elements to the story that clearly exist because of that original story. Like even just using the Fight Club music, where Fight Club seems to be more intentionally reminiscent of Jekyll and Hyde, which we'll talk about more when we get to Fight Club. Malignant is still a fun watch if you like this kind of horror. As somebody who is easily terrified and skeeved out, especially by gore, I recommend that if you're like me, you don't watch the prison scene near the end of the movie. When it looks like there's a seizure happening, you can just skip like a whole 5 to 10 minutes or something. And you're welcome in advance for that. Although I guess if you do like gore, then that's something to look forward to. I plan on watching and reviewing all of the examples y'all gave in the comments. If there's anything at all that you want to see a comparative reading to Jekyll and Hyde, then feel free to comment them. I will slowly get to all of them. We just watched Arthur's Jekyll and Hyde episode.
'Cause I was Jekyll, Jekyll, Hyde, Jekyll, Hyde, Hyde, Jekyll, 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 Hyde, Jekyll, Hyde.
Let's talk about how it compares to the original. Okay, so for context, Arthur is a preschool-age children's show about a child anthropomorphic aardvark living his life in the city. He does a lot of regular PBS stuff of like introducing kids to new ways of living and morality, etc., while just being like a fun little show. It also, very famously, has a song about how having fun isn't hard when you have a library card.
Having fun isn't hard when you've got a library card. Having fun isn't hard when you've got a library card.
Which comes from this same episode. I hadn't remembered the connection, so I was surprised to find out that we were watching one of the most iconic Arthur episodes. Probably the most besides the one about swearing.
You're a No, you are! You look like a You're a Well, did you see it to him? What in did they do when you did? Thanks for teaching it to us, you guys, I think we need to have a talk about this.
Anyways, the episode is called Arthur's Almost Live Not Real Music Festival. And it's about Arthur and his friend Buster showing Arthur's little sister DW how to imagine music in their heads. / like watch TV with their imagination. And then it has like 5 music video-esque songs, the first and last being Library Card and the second being Jekyll and Hyde. We're mostly going to talk about Jekyll and Hyde here, but here's our short review of the episode after having just seen it. What's your review of the Arthur musical episode that had the Jekyll and Hyde song in it?
Iconic. Solid adaptation. 10
It
out of 10.
It really was. It was really good. I was kind of shocked at not only how entertaining this episode was, but also educational in such like subtle ways. And I know Arthur is on PBS, like that's the point. But not only is the Jekyll and Hyde portion shockingly pretty similar to the book, but the other songs are also referencing classics. Leftovers Galosh showed actual leftover food from previous Arthur episodes while also playing snippets of classical music combined as Arthur's dad was singing about it. And Library Card was showing real interesting classical literature at the library, both for adults but also for kids. I don't know, I was just really surprised at how good it was. My partner studies developmental psychology. He was really surprised at how good it was. For a preschool show, to be clear, it's not like for adult entertainment. It was mostly fun to watch because we're nerds who are into all of these literary references. Okay, but with all of that out of the way, let's talk about Jekyll and Hyde specifically. So this short song tells the story of Arthur's friend Brain, who checks Jekyll and Hyde out of the library. He reads it and he ends up doing his own little experiment, which produces a serum that he drinks and turns him into an evil version of himself. Important to note here, not a different being, an evil version of himself that he enjoys being. To be clear, in this episode, Brain is dreaming these things. They're not actually happening. He'll read the book, go to bed, and then dream that he is turning into Hyde. Which is also in line with the original framing of the episode. Books can help you imagine things that TV can't. Anyways, he wakes up, he's himself, he puts the book away, but then at night he takes the book out again and reads it and has another dream. This time he's at school, he's himself, Brain, but then something upsets him, so he drinks the potion and turns into Hyde on purpose. He makes the choice to become his Hyde self so that he can do an evil thing that he wouldn't have done as himself. Hyde persona allows him to get over what would prevent him from carrying out evil actions. It is not the cause of why he wants to do them. Then he feels shame and guilt for what he's done, so he tries to throw away the potion, but he transforms anyway. All of which, happens in the book. Obviously under different circumstances, and the evil acts they do as Hyde are different. And it ends quite different. Brain embraces becoming Hyde, where in the end, Jekyll rejects his identity as either person. But Brain's ending is just a fun child ending. The adaptational element of Jekyll and Hyde as a concept is pretty true to the source material. Shockingly so for this age group of children's media. I mean, it shouldn't be that surprising, it's PBS. Although there are some interesting implications happening here, there isn't really an addictive or societal shame theme happening. Although I suppose you could argue that there's kind of an addictive element because Brain keeps going back to the book, but it's portrayed as a good thing. I think there's this element that's in line with the whole episode of making classical literature seem fun. It's kind of like the theme that ties all of the musical numbers together. Indulging in past stories and learning from them can be fun and entertaining and interesting. So Arthur's goal of keeping in line with the original text isn't to keep the same ideas or themes. It's not really trying to extrapolate a moral lesson for preschoolers from this classic literature, which is how many children's show, especially this age, tend to adapt classics, pulling a lesson from it that they can impart onto their audience. Instead, the lesson that Arthur wants to share is that reading is fun. That's why it's not following other movie versions or adaptational tropes. It's pulling from the book directly because it wants to tell you that the book is entertaining. The main elements that it changes are purely to make the book look more fun. In the end, when Brain's copy of the book is overdue, he's asked if he wants to return it, and he says no, he wants to renew it. Because reading is fun. And there's a deeper conversation to be had here about the push for reading to children in the 90s. People my age and younger tend to not realize just how much publishing has changed, especially children's publishing, since the 90s. And a large part of that is because of Harry Potter, and that's typically what gets talked about. And from an industry perspective, Harry Potter changed the publishing world. But I think we tend to overstate Harry Potter's role in this to a degree, and ignore the lead up to its success. The 90s was full of shows like Arthur and Reading Rainbow telling children that reading was fun, trying to reintroduce them to the possibility of enjoying it, which felt like an uphill climb with the emergence of ever-growing digital entertainment. And when we talk about how Harry Potter changed the publishing industry for children, we tend to ignore how these shows contributed to its success. The shows like Arthur and Reading Rainbow were not doing this in isolation. If you grew up at this time, I'm sure you can remember being told how fun reading is all of the time. And I think that's a pretty admirable element to these children's programming, especially how Arthur's doing it here. We want you to engage with important cultural history. Knowing these things, reading these things can be important to understanding a lot of media and a lot of history. And it is really entertaining. And by just changing a few things to show kids how it can be, I think Arthur is doing an excellent job. This is only the second adaptation that I've watched in this series, and it's going to be pretty hard to beat. Because it's true. Having fun isn't hard when you have a library card. And on that note, I highly recommend you check out this creator because they are not only carrying on this mantra, but really embodying the essence of reading and going to the library is fun. And I think we need more of that. Okay, this story was incredibly interesting, but kind of really sad. Let's talk about Horace Wells, the man many have called the real-world Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and some have theorized is the inspiration for the original story. Now, since this is not only based on a true story but a real person, the depiction of Jekyll and Hyde in Dark Matters Twisted But True is going to be quite a bit different than the other adaptations we've been talking about in this series. We're going to talk about this episode, but also dig a little bit further into Dr. Wells and whether or not he was actually the inspiration for Jekyll and Hyde. Wells was an American dentist in the 1800s who's famous for popularizing anesthesia in dentistry, particularly laughing gas. Wells attended a performance put on by a showman demonstrating the effects of nitrous oxide or laughing gas. Part of the show had someone getting injured but not experiencing any pain. Wells realized this could have use in his work as a dentist because at the time, dentistry was very bloody and painful. So Wells met with the showman Samuel Colton and they started conducting experiments, the first being on Wells himself. Wells had a tooth extracted under the effects of nitrous oxide and experienced no pain. And as he continued to do these trials, they all produced the same results, that laughing gas was an effective anesthesia for dentistry. Then he decided to put on a big demonstration for the medical community where he was going to unveil his discovery of the effectiveness of laughing gas. Unfortunately, during this demonstration was the first time that the anesthesia failed. The man who volunteered to have his tooth extracted ended up being in extreme pain during the procedure in front of everybody. At the time, we were unaware of how nitrous oxide actually worked, or really any anesthesia, and so we didn't know that alcohol or obesity could have an effect on how effective it was. The amount of anesthesia that Wells gave the man was ineffective for how much he weighed, but also was affected by the fact that he had had alcohol. Of course, Wells and nobody else knew this, so he became like a disgraced, disregarded quack. At least that's how everybody saw him. This caused him to go kind of nuts, experimenting with different anesthetics because he was trying to figure out what happened exactly. Many of these experiments were performed on himself, including a high-dosage chloroform one. During a chloroform-induced haze, Wells goes into the streets and throws acid onto a prostitute, completely disfiguring her and landing him in jail. This is like the Jekyll and Hyde aspect, where his scientific experiments end up causing him to do something horrible while under the effects of a drug. He ends up committing suicide in prison, thinking that he will never be seen as anything other than a disgraced nut job and a criminal. However, days before he died, he was awarded with his pioneering efforts into anesthesia, which people had used his research and studies to further its development. Unfortunately, he never received the news. It came too late to the prison and he had already committed suicide. Now, the show Dark Matters Twisted But True did not create the idea that he may have been the basis for Jekyll and Hyde, but it did sensationalize it. This was a Science Channel show that looked into dark, weird science experiments that happened throughout history and really speculated a lot about them. This episode about Horace Wells not only talked about his potential connection to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but also Nikola Tesla's potential death ray he may have invented, and zombies. Lots of speculation going on. Thankfully, they didn't change the story to be even more like Jekyll and Hyde. Like, they didn't depict him as looking like an entirely different person under the effects of chloroform. But is there any validity to the idea that Wells' story was the inspiration for Robert Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde? Well, despite Horace Wells' story happening before Stevenson was even born, and being a quite popular one, I ended up finding a research paper about how there's very little evidence to this claim. Wells' story was very popular in America, where he was from, but Stevenson was from Scotland. There's also no records of Stevenson ever mentioning this case, and Stevenson claims that the inspiration for Jekyll and Hyde came from a dream. It's possible Stevenson heard some variation of this story that like subconsciously inspired him, but it's a very, very loose connection to begin with. Although I think what's really fun about this research paper I found is that you would probably assume that it was written by two, like, literary scholars or perhaps historians, but it was actually written by two anesthesiologists, and I think that's so fun. Like, it's not coming from the literary history of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It's coming from the scientific history of Horace Wells. Like, that's so fun. You go, science boys. You read all of Stevenson's letters. Anyways, even though it doesn't seem to be the inspiration for Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, it's quite interesting how retellings of this story have created a connection between the two. Jekyll and Hyde might not be inspired by Horace Wells' story, but in a way, retellings of Horace Wells' story are inspired by Jekyll and Hyde. It's kind of another really interesting way that history can get rewritten. Today we're going to talk about our first actual adaptation of Jekyll and Hyde, The Nutty Professor. I know that may come as a surprise to many of you, but this is our first full-length movie that is actually based on the book, not just a trope. The 1996 film with Eddie Murphy is actually a remake of the 1963 film, but in both cases they are obviously parodying The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. They're meant to be comedies. For the sake of this video, we're just going to be looking at the 1996 film, although if anybody wants me to look at the 63 version, feel free to ask. The difference between the two is what makes the Dr. Jekyll character unattractive for their time. So in the 1963 version, the Dr. Jekyll character has buck teeth, is really nerdy, and like socially awkward and clumsy. In the 1996 version, he's fat. Every 90s fat stereotype that you can imagine. So here's just like a quick plot summary. It's about a fat professor named Sherman Crump who meets Carla Purdy and then takes a serum so that he can become like skinny and hot, and creates a new persona named Buddy Love so that he can try to like date her as this skinny version of himself. But it all kind of blows up because Buddy is an asshole and he realizes he should have just stayed Fat Sherman all along. And yeah, a lot of the comedy in this movie is derived from making jokes about being fat or overeating. Yeah, they're not good. Before anybody comes into my comments and is like, people can't joke about anything these days, I just want to say, even if we were all down with fat jokes, they're just not funny in this movie. Like, they're genuinely not funny jokes. Like, he's too fat to sit in a chair. Ooh, so funny. We shouldn't make fat-phobic jokes in general, but if you're gonna, they gotta be funnier than that. Even at the time, the fat jokes were criticized for being too generic and safe. But even outside of those, there was a lot of slapstick humor, which didn't really hit as well as it probably did in the 90s, especially if kids were watching this film. Yeah, personally, I think the funniest moments are when Eddie Murphy is talking to his family, which are all played by him also. So I will say, in terms of like fat representation, even though there are a lot of jokes made at the expense of the Dr. Jekyll character, aka Sherman, love interest is interested in him from the very beginning, and she actually doesn't even really like Buddy Love until he starts insulting somebody who made fun of Sherman. She only really starts liking him because he seems to defend this person who is her friend and potential love interest. And in the end, she asks Sherman to dance with her, and she says that Buddy was too scrawny anyways. Even though the movie is constantly making jokes at Sherman's expense, the overall message is one of like self-love and self-acceptance, because it was really always about his self-esteem and his self-image being told by other people, not the love interest, that he is unattractive, ugly, etc. And like, it's kind of a good thing in the end, but at the same time, they spent the whole movie making all of these fat-phobic jokes, so does it really say something about self-love, or is it really saying like something negative about fat people? I don't know, it was just some interesting choices, especially considering this movie fits into the kind of family movie that doesn't really exist anymore. Nutty Professor is intended to be enjoyed by all audiences, adults and children. This kind of movie doesn't happen as often anymore. Like, obviously there are Disney adults who will go see Disney movies, but the Disney movies are marketed towards children. They are meant to be viewed by children, even if anybody can enjoy them. This movie was meant to be enjoyed by everyone. It is a family film, and that's not something that happens quite as often anymore, since people can go on their own devices and watch whatever movies that are particularly targeted towards them. Not saying it never happens, just saying this style in particular is quite uncommon nowadays. And I imagine it played a large factor in the target audience of this movie, who this movie was meant to be for explicitly. Anyways, I know I've been going off about the Nutty Professor specifically, but let's finally answer the question, what does this have to do with Jekyll and Hyde, and how faithful is it to the source material? Obviously, the Professor, Sherman, is Dr. Jekyll, and Buddy Love is Mr. Hyde. Like with most adaptations, Utterson has been removed, and the protagonist is the Jekyll-Hyde character themselves. In both the book and this movie, the Jekyll character creates a serum specifically to change their appearance. That they can do something in society that they otherwise couldn't. And like, part of this adaptational element is that he is actually a scientist creating a serum, not having this transformation happen some other way, but also the fact that he is still the same person when he is both of these characters. I actually kind of love how the Nutty Professor creates like an actual reason why Buddy is acting like out of character. With Hyde, it's a little unclear why he does some of the things that he does, and it feels like there's a much lower impulse control. Like, everything he does is stuff that he would want to, but one of the things he does he really shouldn't, but he lacks the impulse control now that he is Hyde. And Jekyll talks about actually feeling differently when he is Hyde. Like, he is the same person the whole time, but his emotions and presumably hormones are like changed somehow. The Nutty Professor, they just explicitly say it's because his testosterone levels are sky high. Now, would having like crazy increased testosterone levels actually cause you to act this way? Who knows? I'm not a scientist, but I did think that it was an interesting way to explain why he changes in personality as well, despite maintaining the same consciousness. Although I think that factor is kind of complicated near the end, where the conflict seems to be about Buddy Love always wanting to be Buddy Love. So in a way, he is his own distinct identity. Like, him and Sherman have a fight mid-transformation where they're like punching their own body. Like, one could argue that this is the common adaptational change, that at the end they become different people, like different entities somehow. But I like to think that it's always the same person, it's always the same consciousness going on. He remembers everything between both, but it's just his feelings are different when he is either, which is kind of in line with the book. That's how Jekyll describes his own experience. He feels differently as Hyde. I think it presents a very interesting question of how much of who we are is ruled by our emotions and even hormones, because most of the time we tend to think of ourselves as like a culmination of our memories. So when we know that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde share memories, they feel like the same person to us. But if their feelings are different, like the Nutty Professor's character's feelings are different, can they be seen as different entities? I don't think it fully applies to the original story, but the comparison really opens the door for this question of what makes us us. I think that's fun and a weird revelation coming from the Nutty Professor. So I just realized something kind of odd about the gay Jekyll and Hyde SNL sketch, and I wanted to take this opportunity to talk more about it and the queer interpretations of the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Gentlemen, it is time you learnt of Mr. Hyde.
So about a decade ago, SNL had this sketch where Dr. Jekyll was caught having sex with another man by his wife.
Tell us, Dr. Jekyll, what do you do when you become this Mr. Hyde?
When I'm Mr. Hyde, mainly, I have sex with men.
It's true. I've caught him doing it.
That's right, but I explained about the serum, and now you know why I had sex with those men.
Because of you couldn't control yourself. You're Mr. Hyde.
Yes, I'm attracted to women, like my wife. It's Mr. Hyde who does stuff with guys.
The joke is obviously that he's using the Hyde identity as an excuse so that he can go have gay sex.
You continue to take it even though men have sex with Mr. Hyde?
Okay, let me clarify something right now. Men don't have sex with Mr. Hyde. Mr. Hyde has sex with men.
It's a, cute, funny little sketch. And it honestly is kind of a really good way of talking about the queer interpretation of the original book. Because the idea is that Dr. Jekyll turns into Mr. Hyde so that he can do things that Dr. Jekyll couldn't do in a socially acceptable way in Victorian society. We never find out exactly what it is that Mr. Hyde is up to in the middle of the night. We only find out about the crimes that he's committed, during the day. In both cases, they were, unusual incidents for Hyde. Dr. Jekyll basically says that Hyde wasn't violent until those moments. So whatever he's been doing in secret that is not acceptable to Victorian society is not violent. And many have taken it to be having gay sex. This fits pretty well in line with the SNL sketch. He has to take a serum to turn into Mr. Hyde.
When is the last time you took the serum?
Last night.
He is fully aware of what he's doing when he is Mr. Hyde.
You almost done? I thought we were going dancing.
I'm Dr. Jekyll right now, Julius.
Oh, right. Well, what time you're gonna become Mr. Hyde?
And Mr. Hyde is doing things that Dr. Jekyll wants to, but that society wouldn't accept him to do.
Fire Island! It sounds like a monstrous hell!
If that's hell, sign me up. What I'd like to do with this funding is to go to this island, take the serum every day, and just take the serum every day. That's my plan.
The major difference is that in the SNL sketch, he looks the same because the potion's not real.
Dr. Jekyll, can we see this serum?
I forgot to bring it.
And there's an implication that he gets more into it while he's Mr. Hyde in the original book. Dr. Jekyll says that he has these urges to do the Hyde things more when he is Hyde. There's kind of two main differences between the SNL sketch's queer representation of the story and the actual story itself. Aside from the fact that the SNL sketch is obviously not telling the same story.
Julius, are you also under the spell of a serum?
Yeah, Zima.
But one, kind of interesting change that happens in it is that there's a lecture happening. So Dr. Jekyll is, telling his colleagues, effectively, about this process that he has.
My fellow scientist, you may have noticed that my behavior as of late has been erratic and occasionally disturbing.
It's obviously being played up for laughs. This isn't, meant to mean anything. What's interesting about it is that this is kind of an adaptational change. So the SNL sketch is, whether intentionally or not, pulling from this queer reading of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I mean, there's kind of a potential queerness baked into it that they're taking advantage of in order to make this joke. This lecture that he's giving to other people is an invention of Jekyll and Hyde adaptations that I think exists in order to remove Utterson. And this is not just about the SNL sketch. I'm talking about in general, representations and adaptations of Jekyll and Hyde typically don't have Utterson, who is the protagonist of the original Jekyll and Hyde story, because any adaptation of Jekyll and Hyde is going to make Jekyll the main character. And so they need to come up with all of these ways to replace Utterson or change the story to accommodate for the fact that Utterson's not there. Because the original story is about Utterson, who doesn't know that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are the same person, and like kind of slowly discovering this. I've already talked about some of the ways that this happens in other videos, but one very interesting way is through this lecture. Now, what this lecture is actually doing in most adaptations that have it, including the SNL sketch, is explaining the motivations that Dr. Jekyll has for creating this serum. Because if you make Dr. Jekyll the protagonist and make him a good person separate from Hyde, then you need to have some kind of an excuse for why he would create this serum in the first place. There needs to be a kind of altruistic reason. And this lecture serves to give us that reason, because he can't just say it randomly. Other times we see this reason given to another character, such as Lanyon in the 1920 silent film. Either way, the lecture exists as an adaptational device to give us Dr. Jekyll's new motivation. And that lecture tends to facilitate an altruistic, or at least for the sake of science, reason, which is very common for Gothic literature, although the SNL sketch obviously subverts this, which could arguably be part of the humor. The other aspects I want to talk about is how the original text has more queer elements to it than this SNL sketch represents. For example, in this sketch, and many adaptations of Jekyll and Hyde, there is a woman who is potentially his love interest. I mean, obviously in this sketch, the joke is that, you know, he's gay and sleeping with men, not his wife.
But it's too dangerous for me to go, right, honey?
Yes, Fire Island's no place for a woman. You're not coming. Gentlemen.
The original text is actually devoid of women and is kind of more about male friendships and part of the like societal expectations that you might have between male friends. And this is very fitting for the time this book was written, because this is when male friendships were starting to become less intimate. In like Western society, it used to be more acceptable and even expected for you to like kiss your friend and like talk about them in a very loving way, at least how we would consider to be loving now. And that's something I've gotten into in many videos, but it really fits with all of the themes surrounding privacy and duality of lives, something that was starting to really develop around this time. I mean, queer interactions existed before this, but it was kind of easier to hide them in a lot of ways, or express them through a societally acceptable way. I'm not saying that it was sunshines and rainbows, I'm just saying that the culture was changing at this time surrounding how male friendships and your interactions with other men were perceived and what actions were allowed. There was a new law passed around this time that didn't allow for any gross indecency between two men. This was a very broad term that was widely abused and really changed the culture. You can also see a queer reading in the language that's being used in the text, especially with Dr. Jekyll's interactions with Lanyon. Also, his letter at the end is incredibly queer-coded. All this talk of desire and hiding and acceptability, and the language itself is very homoerotic at times. Of course, the entire story is told through Utterson's perspective, a kind of societal lens. Hyde radiates a sort of evilness to him. I'm very interested in seeing more queer adaptations of Jekyll and Hyde, obviously beyond just this SNL sketch that's meant to be a joke, because I think that there is a lot that you can do with this story, especially when you remove Utterson as kind of an obstacle to the queer reading of the text, which many stories remove him, but will try to like heteroify it by adding in like some kind of love interest for either Hyde or Jekyll.
This story sounds rather incredible.
Well, my husband is an incredible scientist.
Female love interest typically, which is fine. I think that many of those adaptations can also be really interesting. I'm just curious to see more that happen to be queer and what they can pull from the text exactly.
Jekyll, are you worried that you'll become Mr. Hyde and it will last forever?
Oh, don't worry. When he's Mr. Hyde, he can't last more than 5 minutes.
All right. All right. It's 11. Let's go. Honey, don't wait up for me. I'll be home when Hyde's done. Bye.
The most accurate version of Jekyll and Hyde is VeggieTales.
Somebody who's been watching dozens of Jekyll and Hyde adaptations recently, I can tell you this is significantly more accurate than you'd expect. So yeah, for today's part in our look at Jekyll and Hyde adaptations, we're going to be talking about VeggieTales, Dr. Jiggle, and Mr. Sly.
Ever since I was a little boy in widely tailored pants, my only aspiration was to be a gourd who danced.
You should watch the rest of Bueller's video and then come back to this one. He's right. Most Jekyll and Hyde adaptations, even the ones that have the name Jekyll and Hyde, aren't actually trying to adapt the book. They're just trying to use this cultural idea of Jekyll and Hyde to talk about the duality of man. To them, Jekyll and Hyde is just building blocks that we can use to explore the themes that the book is dealing with. Which is why it's wild that a show like VeggieTales, which is obsessed with theming and moralizing it to impart some kind of lesson on its audience, like the only story I've seen so far that is actually trying to adapt the novel itself instead of just the themes that the novel is exploring.
We've come to warn you. You've an intruder, a detestable disco-dancing villain ducked through your back door.
A big part of this is following Utterson as the protagonist instead of Jekyll, where most adaptations don't even have Utterson at all. Keeping the audience unaware that Jiggle and Sly are the same person so that it's like a mystery, just like the novel. It also pulls like direct scenes and quotes from the book, which you would normally expect from an adaptation, but is actually pretty groundbreaking for a Jekyll and Hyde one. Utterson can even sort of sense that there's something off about the Sly character, which is just kind of a strange element to retain in a story like this. If not strange, then at the very least unexpected.
There's something wrong with his appearance. Something displeasing. Something downright detestable.
That's like almost an exact quote from the book. And I also imagine they gave Butterbuns this accent because the author, Robert Stevenson, was Scottish. The part that really stuck out to me as like, this is the novel, is when they're talking to Dr. Jiggle through the window.
I trust you're well, Doctor.
I've been feeling a little woozy lately.
Look, Doctor, why don't you join us? We're about to watch your friend dance. It'll do you good to get outside and whip up your circulation.
Well,
Dr. Jiggle!
This is almost an identical scene in the book that so few adaptations have. Although I'll also say something endearing about this is in the end, it doesn't even actually make sense. Like, this is supposed to be a forced, unexpected transformation for Jekyll, but it just isn't here. Like, Dr. Jiggle just wants to dance as Mr. Sly. He doesn't have to transform into him. Which is also where it's interesting how VeggieTales is actually kind of really changing the theming of the story despite following the book so closely. The message in the end is like, accept yourself the way God made you because VeggieTales is religious.
You're special just the way God made you.
And like, you could argue that comes from Stevenson's original story as well, but the novel is more exploring society's role in shame rather than like your individual shame. Like, Jekyll doesn't need to turn into Hyde because he wouldn't accept himself, it's because society wouldn't accept Mr. Hyde. And unlike Mr. Sly, we see that Hyde cannot exist in Victorian society. But like, Jiggle doesn't think that dancing is socially unacceptable, and we see that people like it. It's purely about his own insecurities and feeling like people would not want to see him, Dr. Jiggle, dance.
all I ever wanted to do was dance, but I was afraid people would laugh at me for being so jiggly.
VeggieTales really just tries to pull the most positive interpretation possible from the original novel, which is fair, it's a story for kids. But the fact that it can do this while being so accurate to the book is actually really impressive. The main thing it removes is all of the characters who experience death, except for Jekyll and Hyde, but they get a happy ending instead. It also turns the butler Poole into a sort of flounder for Utterson. Like, Poole is investigating with Utterson near the very end of the novel, but throughout it, he's like not super involved. But in VeggieTales, since we don't get Utterson's internal monologue, we have Poole there so that Butterbuns can like say whatever he's thinking. Although they also turned Poole into like my favorite kind of flounder character. Like, I loved this little cucumber in this short.
Ah! What? The hand!
What?
He's so funny because he's like aware that Butterbuns is acting weird, like he's in some kind of story.
What?
I love the kind of comedy duo where the straight man is just confused, and that's done like so well here. But yeah, this is a widely accurate to the book adaptation of Jekyll and Hyde where they are the same person and even have different heights. And it has so many direct moments from the book, including him saying, if he be Mr. Sly, then I be Mr. Sneak, which is a reference to if he be Mr. Hyde, then I be Mr. Seek.
I'm going to get to the bottom of this. If he be Mr. Sly, I shall be Mr. Sneak.
That was actually the best line in this whole VeggieTales thing. But yeah, like Bueller said, it's actually pretty worth checking out on YouTube. It's just so goofy and weird the way that VeggieTales always is, while also being just so strangely accurate to the book, although, like I said, changing the theme. And obviously changing the tone, except maybe this little intro part. And a nice moral about self-acceptance, although the way they sneak religion in at the end is so unsubtle. It's so out of place with the rest of the story and just makes it even funnier.
You see, Dr. Jiggle, when you know God made you special, it doesn't matter what anyone else thinks. You can just be yourself.
And to be clear, there is still a lot removed from the story, and the ending is obviously different, but those changes are clearly only there because the story was made for children. So we might be able to find an adult adaptation that is more accurate to the book story, but I'm not sure how likely that is since most adaptations are pulling from random elements from the book. So we're going to be hard-pressed to find something that is actually trying to adapt the story more accurately than Dr. Jiggle and Mr. Sly. There's so much more that could still be said about this adaptation. It's just so weird. So thank you, Bueller, for making a video about it and bringing it to our attention.
I want to dance. I want to groove. I need to feel the rush of the wind under my shoes.
Jekyll and Hyde the musical is actually one of the most interesting adaptations of the book.
Can you hide? Set me free. Can't you see you want me?
The only adaptation we've talked about so far, other than VeggieTales, that actually keeps Utterson. But his role in the musical is so interesting because he's not the protagonist anymore. Instead, Jekyll is, but Utterson is his friend trying to figure out what's happening, just like he is in the book.
The burden he placed on me was unbearable. I was a blind witness, allowed to hear his cries of anguish, forbidden to seek him, to understand, or to help.
The musical basically asks the question, what are all the things that Jekyll was up to that Utterson didn't get to see? And it shows us that by making Jekyll the protagonist. Honestly, the coolest part of having read the novel before watching this is seeing all of these moments that Utterson is having where he's like getting the will from Jekyll and witnessing him acting strange and whatnot, and he's still living in the mystery that he lives in the novel, but we are not. And for like a big chunk of the musical, probably the first 3/4 of it, Utterson is following his exact role in the novel. So for the last quarter, he gets kind of merged with the character of Lanyon witnessing Jekyll transform, and the ending is like unique to the musical. But until that point, the musical has a very cool relationship to the novel through Utterson, and trying to show Utterson's story from a different perspective. And that's probably the coolest thing in the musical to me. However, outside that connection to the novel, this musical was an absolute campy mess.
It's a nightmare we can never restore. So we stay on our guard, going out the facade. What's behind the facade? Look behind the facade.
Probably unintentionally too, which made it all the better to watch. Especially with David Hasselhoff, who I feel like was only there so that he could rip open his shirt near the end.
They'll never be able to separate Jekyll from Hyde. Can't you see it?
Because even though his performance was good and his singing wasn't bad, his vibrato was extreme and distracting. It was in every single song. And like, again, the singing wasn't bad, the performance was good, but the vibrato was a lot, especially if you listen to the original cast recording.
It can be done long after you're gone.
I'm not like the best judge of music ever, I can't sing, but it was a little distracting and the original Broadway cast recording was a lot clearer. Although this is the only version you can really watch on YouTube, and I do recommend checking it out, although I think I found it much campier than a lot of the comments did. So take that as you will.
You're on your earth. Is there any further justification?
Aside from his singing, I thought the songs were pretty fun, especially Murder Murder. That was a ball.
To kill outside St. Paul's requires a lot of fools.
He hates the upper class.
He must be on his ass.
It made no sense for the tone of the rest of the musical, but it was very fun. Now, as far as the story goes, it kind of runs with the beast within kind of narrative, although it's kind of inconsistent with how much these characters are the same person. Hyde purposely transformed into Jekyll in front of Utterson so that Jekyll could give Utterson a letter to give to Lucy, warning her that Hyde was going to come after her. And then when Hyde comes after her, he's like surprised that Jekyll gave her this letter. And you're like, wait, why did you transform Hyde back into Jekyll in front of Utterson then? Like, what was the goal there? It feels like it's because they're the same person, right? But then they have this fight where they're like trying to get control over the body.
Live inside you forever. No, Satan himself by my side. No.
Which, don't get me wrong, was very fun. I loved that part. But like, the duality of man here is a little confusing.
All that you are is a face in the mirror. I close my eyes and you disappear. I'm what you face when you face in the mirror. Long as you live, I will still be here.
Although some of the adaptational changes from the book are very interesting. Like, they removed the character of Lanyon, or merged him with Utterson, but they kept the guy that Mr. Hyde killed. But instead of him killing Cardew, I think his name is, Cardew is his father-in-law. And it just feels kind of like a random choice because Emma is entirely invented for the musical. I mean, she is kind of common in adaptations of Jekyll and Hyde. Usually Dr. Jekyll is given some kind of love interest, either a fiance for him, like they do here, or a like kind of showgirl for Mr. Hyde, like they do here also. That showgirl is usually meant to like tempt Dr. Jekyll away from his fiance, and that's why Mr. Hyde is happy to go after her, because he can do whatever he wants. That's the whole point of the like dual identity. But like in many adaptations, it's unclear how much Dr. Jekyll has control over like the Mr. Hyde character. Lucy seems to be meant to be part of his inner darkness, while Emma is like his light. That's why they have those color motifs. So I appreciate, like in many Jekyll and Hyde adaptations, the Lucy character is her own independent character with like her own desires, etc., and not just a prop. The scene where he tells her to leave actually reminded me a lot of Fight Club, which is another adaptation we're going to be talking about at some point. But what I thought was really funny about that scene is how Utterson gives her this letter that's like, get the hell out of here, you're in danger. And she goes, that's nice. I'm gonna take a nap first, though. Oh, look, it's that letter from Jekyll warning me to get out of town if I don't want to die. Oh, he's so cute. Okay, time for bed. That isn't ominous at all. Time to sleep off that silly little letter warning of my impending murder.
Dearest Lucy. What? You weren't expecting me.
No, sir.
What? Yes, you were. Like, I'm just gonna go crawl into bed and just see what happens, you know? And then when Mr. Hyde shows up, she's like, oh my god. Like, girl, you were warned. We told you this was gonna happen. I don't know. It was a really fun musical, and I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts on it. It was just very strange, in a way that was kind of fun and campy to me, although I'm not sure if that was the goal. I just wish they went a little further with Utterson and had him keep the role all the way up until the end, but of course they couldn't because the end was changed entirely and he ends up like turning into Hyde during the wedding. As far as accuracy goes, I think this play fits well into like the canon of Jekyll and Hyde adaptations that are not really adapting the novel, except for when it comes to Utterson, and I think that's something really unique and interesting about this musical. Also, Murder Murder hits hard, which is also hilarious because in the book, he isn't actually going around as a serial killer, he just murders one guy, but in the musical, they're like, we need to have him kill a whole ton of people so that we can have this, like, really catchy number. And honestly, that's how to make a musical.
You like the show? Did you like the show? Please tell your friends, and I wanted to personally say on camera thank you to the people at the Plymouth Theater and SFX, and mostly the cast and crew, who kind of spoon-fed me because I've come a long way from the beach and the talking car. And it's going to be a long time to get here. But I'm not leaving. Thank you for making my dream come true. Good night, everybody. Hope you enjoyed the show.
There's no Jekyll and Hyde adaptation in Pokemon, right? Like, that would be way too convenient for the guy covered in Pokemon tattoos doing a whole series on Jekyll and Hyde adaptations.
Morpeko?
I mean, like, if there was, it's gotta be a nobody character, right? Like, it can't be somebody important or an actual Pokemon.
Don't take it elsewhere!
Morpeko!
Morpeko is a guinea pig Pokemon with the ability Hunger Switch, which causes it to switch between two different forms. One is the cute and friendly full belly mode, the Jekyll. The other is its hangry mode, which is dark, violent, and the Hyde.
Are you hungry again? I just gave you a Clint cookie, didn't I? I'll give you another one.
Now, no matter which mode it's in, it's always technically an electric dark type, but when it's in its full belly mode, it has a move that is an electric type, and when it's in its hangry mode, that move is a dark type, signifying that its hangry mode is, you know, the more evil dark one.
Morpeko, the two-sided Pokemon, an electric and dark type. Morpeko satisfies its constant hunger and generates electricity by eating seeds from a pocket-like pouch.
Now, a really interesting connection between Morpeko and Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is how the full-belly Morpeko is not actually the good one. It becomes angry when it's hungry and not being fed, transforming it into its hangry mode, which just causes it to be more evil. As we see in the anime, James's Morpeko is still kind of a bully when it's in its full-belly mode. It's just not as violent as it is when it's hangry.
Look at that grin! It appears Morpeko has actually eaten its fill!
Hey, keep going! Why change now?
Where is that ravenous rage?
See, you've still got more spice cakes!
Make history! Manja!
Morpeko has left the table!
And in case somebody thinks this is not a purposeful reference, it's worth noting that Pokemon's 8th generation takes place in Galar, which is based off of England. A lot of the locations and Pokemon are based off of English history and culture. So having a Pokemon based off of Jekyll and Hyde is actually not that weird. Although I think Morpeko generally falls more into the dual personality trope that has evolved from Jekyll and Hyde rather than actually referencing the book. But the fact that Morpeko remains the same being with the same goals and identity in both forms makes it a lot closer to the original depiction of Jekyll and Hyde than other tropes that have evolved since it. Like Stevenson's Jekyll and Hyde are the same person, the main difference between them is their appearance and temperament, which is the same for Morpeko. And Jekyll and Morpeko both eventually have forced transformations into their Hyde form, with the only way to turn back being through consuming something. For Jekyll, this is a serum, but for Morpeko, this is food, as we saw him do just now. Also worth noting that in the same game Morpeko comes from, there's a character named Hyde, who is connected to electricity in some way, but other than that, doesn't seem to have any connection to Morpeko or the original Jekyll and Hyde story. In his case, Hyde is short for hydrangea. He looks like this, and his parents are named Honey and Mustard. There are also probably a lot of human characters throughout the history of Pokemon that have some kind of reference to Jekyll and Hyde. Feel free to comment them below. I just thought it would be fun to make a little video about the Pokemon mascot for this adaptation series. And I'm kind of excited to go catch a Morpeko now.
I think I'll be in trouble when the cookies run out.
The Hulk has a very strange relationship with the classic story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. As this commenter points out, many Jekyll and Hyde adaptations will turn Hyde into a sort of Hulk figure, where he is big, brooding, and powerful. He becomes supernaturally strong and so aggressive and angry that he is barely human anymore and he can't speak properly. And the inspiration for these powerful evil Hyde adaptations is almost always obviously the Hulk or werewolves. And we will get to werewolves another day, but the interesting thing about Jekyll and Hyde stories that pull inspiration from the Hulk is that the Hulk pulled inspiration from the original Jekyll and Hyde story itself. Not just the cinematic universe Incredible Hulk, although we will primarily be talking about him today, but like Stan Lee's original Hulk in the 1970s was inspired by Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And this inspiration is hard not to see once you know about it. An intelligent scientist has some kind of accidental science experiment that creates an alter ego for him that is this big, brooding monster. On a personal side note, I always thought the Hulk was cool as a kid, but watching these movies for this video, I really think the Incredible Hulk should have been an origin story if they weren't going to make the 2003 movie canon, because it was both confusing and kind of boring, sorry. It's a problem when I found him much more entertaining in She-Hulk, where he is not the main character. But
being a Hulk asks for balance.
But at least in that, he's funnier and his abilities are more interesting. It's not just like a woman having the ability to quell his inner beast. But even then, it's not his story. And She-Hulk really changes his relationship to Jekyll and Hyde. Although we will save She-Hulk for its own video, because she has a lot more thematically cohesive connections to the original Jekyll and Hyde story than the Incredible Hulk does, even after he's like dissolved the Hulk identity into himself.
It's just basically different.
Now, what's really interesting about the difference between the Incredible Hulk and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, including adaptations that pull from the Hulk, is that Hulk is actually not evil. In fact, he is actually the hero, not Bruce. Bruce fills the role of Jekyll by being socially acceptable to society, but the Hulk is the one actually saving the day most of the time. And this really changes the entire story that the Hulk is trying to tell over other Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde adaptations. Like, sure, there are questions of the duality of man, but Bruce and Hulk are not really the same person, at least not in the same way that Jekyll and Hyde are. But even if they were, the Hulk is about like self-control and duty and doing what's right and being a good guy. Learning to use your anger for the greater good rather than let it control you.
Jen, when you have powers like this, it's like putting a target on your back and the backs of all the people you care about.
Oh, cool. Yet another way my life is ruined. Thanks, Bruce!
But Jekyll and Hyde adaptations that make Hyde into a sort of Hulk figure usually make him pretty evil, or at the very least, not heroic. And in the original story, he's not even a different person or have different abilities than Jekyll does. He is Jekyll, he just looks different and has slightly more impulses. On the surface, the stories seem really similar, but the deeper you get into their theming, it becomes more and more apparent just how different they are. And it makes this relationship of like a cycle of inspiration so strange. I watched this version of The Incredible Hulk and the She-Hulk miniseries for this video, and honestly both of them felt so divorced from the original Jekyll and Hyde story. In the She-Hulk miniseries, which was honestly a lot more entertaining, Bruce talks about his relationship to the Hulk that lives inside of him and his anger. And part of me is like, okay, he has like these inner demons that he needs to learn how to like live with or coexist with in order to be like a functional part of society. But I don't think it really works because it doesn't seem like Bruce ever really wanted to do most of the things that he does as the Hulk, at least in regards to how much he enjoys these actions. The Hulk seems to have his own identity and enjoyment levels, but Bruce does not actually like to do the things that he does as the Hulk prior to having like a merged identity. But outside of that, neither story really felt anything like Jekyll and Hyde. I mean, there were just small trace elements of the story. But then when you look at a lot of the Jekyll and Hyde adaptations that are inspired by the Hulk, other than League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, which we will get to, most of them don't actually seem to be dealing with the same themes or anything as the Hulk, and only really seem to be inspired by the Hulk's super strength and like low intelligence compared to his Jekyll counterpart. I don't know, there's a lot more to say about the weird relationship between Hulk and Jekyll and Hyde adaptations, and this serves as kind of an introduction to the sub-archetype of Mr. Hyde being Mr. Hulk. And we'll get to more examples of what this looks like exactly outside of the MCU. Because again, there are a lot of elements that connect this character to Jekyll and Hyde, but the relationship is a lot more complicated than just inspiring each other. Also worth noting that the Hulk's appearance is based off Frankenstein's monster in Quasimodo, which is funny considering how his appearance influences future Hyde adaptations. I think something that really exemplifies how these stories feel similar in terms of like duality, but at the same time are incredibly different in what they're actually trying to say, is this trailer for the comic book.
Together, they were one of the worthy, an engine of destruction and breaker of worlds. But now, the man and the monster are one, no more. Ripped asunder by unknown forces, the two have retreated to opposite corners of the earth. Now, the Hulk has found his home and his peace. But the scientist known as Bruce Banner has only found madness, and the only hero that can stop Banner is his better half.
Okay, let's talk about Victorian fanfiction. Victorian Avengers. The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen.
LXG.
This is going to be a really wild one because for the most part, this series has just been analyzing Jekyll and Hyde adaptations, but this story was adapting many different Victorian and Gilded Age classics. And some moments really did feel like fan fiction, like watching Tom Sawyer from The Adventures of Tom Sawyer try and flirt with Mina Harker from Dracula. Like, what was that? How did this happen? Who thought of this? They deserve an award because the premise alone is kind of hilarious. Like, this is such a goofy group. Anyways, I know it's based off of a comic and graphic novel series, which we can get into another time, but for right now, we're just going to be talking about the movie. And I've been made aware that it is a bad adaptation of the comics, but hopefully that makes this all the more interesting, because I have a lot of thoughts. Also, for clarity, I have read most of the stories that these characters come from. Only one story was I unfamiliar with, and that was Captain Nemo's. Everything else I've either read or already had like a general understanding of. Okay, so the movie was very strange. I feel like the fun part of watching this movie has to be knowing all of these classic characters and watching how weird it is to see them interact in these ways. But I don't actually know how familiar everyone watching this movie was with them. And I feel like the people who would be familiar with all of them might not be the types that would appreciate how they were depicted because it was very, very inaccurate. So if you don't know, the League is like a superhero team made up of a bunch of classic Victorian literature characters like Dorian Gray from The Picture of Dorian Gray, Mina Harker from Dracula, The Invisible Man, Alan Quartermaster, Captain Nemo, Jekyll and Hyde, Tom Sawyer, who's not from a Victorian classic. He's from an American story by my arch enemy, Mark Twain. And if you've not seen my videos on why Mark Twain is my mortal enemy, I'll link them in this one. Anyways, this group of characters, besides like Tom Sawyer kind of, are recruited by M, who you might assume is James Bond based off that moniker, but spoilers, that's a red herring. I meant you might assume he's a character from James Bond. M puts this league together to help him stop the Phantom, aka the Phantom of the Opera, who is trying to set in motion World War I. Then the movie is basically just a whole bunch of action sequences that don't fully make sense and only really have cool graphics when Mina is involved, which is unfortunate because she is pretty underutilized. That's basically the premise of the movie. There's two like kind of big twists-ish. They're both very weird, although one is objectively weirder. Spoiler alert, the Phantom is actually M, the one who recruited all of them, who is actually not James Bond, but James Moriarty, the arch villain of Sherlock Holmes. And this is where we're going to get into our first analysis, because I think Moriarty pretending to be the Phantom and also pretending to be James Bond is incredibly weird. And while I was watching this movie, I was trying to think from like Eric, aka the Phantom of the Opera, and James Bond's perspectives. And it turns out like neither one actually exists. It's just James Moriarty. And it makes those like disguises really weird because those characters didn't actually have the backstories of James Bond and the Phantom. They're just made up by Moriarty, I guess. And Moriarty is supposed to be like a criminal mastermind, but it's really weird how convoluted his plan is. And it required him being two different, like, distinct Victorian literature characters. I mean, James Bond is, like, post-Victorian. Although I will say I do actually kind of like that. I really only have an issue with the Phantom. M being like a moniker for both James Bond and Moriarty, like, makes it a perfect red herring. It only really is there for the audience, but it makes it more interesting. And James Bond's story comes like so much later than the rest of these, which also hints at it being out of place. Although so is Tom Sawyer's story, and we're just not going to question that one. Tom Sawyer is like a goofy prankster kid in Missouri, but in this movie, he's just like a gunslinger who's like a young mentee for Alan. Although Alan Quartermaster is probably one of the more accurate adaptations. If you don't know King Solomon's Mines, Alan Quartermain is basically like an Indiana Jones type. I believe he was the inspiration for Indiana Jones. He's also like the progenitor of the Lost World narratives, which are like the stories of Englishmen coming to Africa and bringing like their civility. It's honestly a pretty messed up genre. Although this story is really just like the origin of that genre, it doesn't really play into it the way that many others do. The story generally tends to be very much like people in Africa have a unique and interesting culture that is equal in civility to any other culture. And like there are many Africans who are more deserving of respect than certain Englishmen. And like it's not a perfect book in this regard, but it's just unfortunate that it paved the way for this really racist genre that it was never really meant to be part of. Anyways, I think that it makes sense for them to depict this like special relationship to Africa that Alan Quartermain has in the movie. Although I think the movie is a lot less respectable towards Africans than the original book is. The Invisible Man is like weirdly cheeky, but it's actually a different character because apparently they couldn't get the rights to H.G. Wells' story. So it just like straight up isn't him. It's just an invisible man. He's a thief instead of a scientist, which is kind of a more useful skill if you're invisible anyways. It's honestly not even really worth comparing to the original story because it's just a different guy with different motivations and thoughts and feelings, etc. Speaking of scientists, Mina Harker is a chemist who is now also a vampire, which is on the one hand the most fun part of the entire movie. The best parts of the film are when Mina is like doing vampire stuff. However, it is a really insane adaptational choice. Like, I can't imagine anybody who's read Dracula not being a little appalled at Mina being a vampire. But you know, she's also a chemist and she does one science thing in the movie, so. She also has a weird relationship to Dorian Gray where it's heavily implied that they were romantically involved, but at the same time, they didn't know each other's like big secret, which I think is really weird. Like at first I thought, oh, they were just a fling, like they just had sex one time. But then it's like really implied that it was more than that. Dorian Gray is adapted very interestingly. In the original story, he makes a deal where this portrait of him will continue to age while he will remain the same. He kind of switches places with the portrait effectively. And along with reflecting his aging that's supposed to happen, it also reflects like his inner sins. The book, the curse is undone and he like kind of switches places with the portrait after he destroys it. Because of like the guilt he feels, it's kind of an allusion to like a Catholic confession. And in this way, he kind of like makes the choice to die and it's part of like a redemption for himself. Whereas in the movie, looking at the portrait is what kills him and he's actually just like an asshole until the very end. I don't know, it just kind of takes away any kind of meaning from it. That's how most of the adaptational changes feel here, like it takes away their meaning and kind of just makes it empty. They all exist purely for cameos. As for Captain Nemo, again, I'm pretty unfamiliar with his story, but it seems like he's a pretty mysterious, swashbuckling character. And he is pretty cool, like he's probably the second most fun character to watch fight after Mina. But at the same time, I don't know, there's something kind of off-putting about the way that he feels so subordinate to everyone else, especially considering it's like his ship that they're all on. And of course I saved Jekyll and Hyde for last. Now, I'll just say right off the bat, this version of Jekyll and Hyde is very clearly based on the Hulk, although the Hulk itself is based off of Jekyll and Hyde, so it's kind of a full circle moment. As far as this depiction goes, it is pretty dissimilar. Jekyll and Hyde are two completely separate identities. They speak to each other like through mirrors. Hyde is like a hulking monster. I mean, like he is literally the Hulk, which I will say is a really common adaptational change for Jekyll and Hyde, is making Hyde like bigger and stronger, although in the original story, Hyde is actually smaller than Jekyll. That's usually how Hyde is identified by other characters, is his shortness. Also, in this version, Jekyll does have to take a serum to turn into Hyde, but Hyde seems to turn back just like when the serum wears off, I guess. I think probably the most interesting retained aspect is a sort of addiction narrative. Jekyll, like, craves the transformation drug, but really in how Hyde, like, is trying to continuously trick him into drinking it. We never actually see Jekyll succumb to this, which I was pretty surprised about, and it kind of diminishes the point of it even being there. But I do think it was a pretty interesting thing to retain, and I appreciated that. Now, there were so many characters to cover that we just kind of did like a very brief analysis for each of them. But overall, this story is like really goofy. It's just meant to be like actiony fun. There is definitely zero integrity for their original source materials. And like, I do appreciate that in a kind of campy way. Although there were honestly times where I was pretty bored by the action sequences. I would have liked to see more interpersonal stuff or more like power-ish fighting. But overall, this was like a dumb fun film. Do not go into it thinking it's going to adapt any of these stories well. That doesn't mean you can't enjoy it. I'm so sorry, but Jekyll and Hyde is probably my least favorite part of the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen.
Home's where the heart is, that's what they say.
I'm like the Jekyll and Hyde guy, and that's the whole reason I watched this movie. I did think this movie was very fun in like a campy, actiony way, including Jekyll and Hyde.
We have trouble. Trouble? I call it sport.
But like, they kind of did him so dirty compared to everyone else. None of the characters are that accurate to their original story, but the movie makes them campy and unique in their own way. Like, Mina is not a vampire in Dracula or in the original LXG comic, but that is the most interesting and fun part about her character in this movie. And she feels like a distinct character. She's not just a carbon copy of another vampire. Unlike Jekyll and Hyde, who is straight up just the Hulk.
Well, this is nice.
In a previous video, I talked about how there are many Jekyll and Hyde adaptations that pull inspiration from the Hulk by making Hyde into a, like, big monstrous figure. But usually they make Hyde evil and not a superhero. The thematics tend to be pretty different from the Hulk. And Jekyll has like his own separate purpose in the story. Typically something to do with him being a scientist, which would have made total sense here. At one point they need a chemist, and Jekyll is someone who makes a chemical compound in order to transform, yet they do not utilize him for this chemistry. That's what Mina is there for, even though she's also a vampire. Instead, Jekyll is exclusively there for Hyde, similar to how the Hulk is part of the Avengers for the Hulk. And it's not that big of a deal that he is narratively, thematically, and aesthetically similar to the Hulk. It's just that he's doing nothing else besides that. He basically has two significant moments. One where he is thirsting after Mina and resists the urge to turn himself into Hyde because he sees her with Dorian. And the other when him and Hyde decide to work together to save everyone. Which is a dramatic moment, but also the only reason he's even part of this group to begin with. I did really enjoy his fight at the end with the guy who took a bunch of his serum, but it kind of made the logistics of the serum more confusing.
Not the whole thing.
I don't know, I think my opinion on him is a bit skewed by the fact that I've been watching all of these Jekyll and Hyde adaptations in terms of how accurate they are towards the original Jekyll and Hyde story, and this one is pretty low in that regard. That and the fact that I'm watching this movie 20 years later where it feels like the action scenes could have been a lot more interesting, but of course it's using 2003 graphics and genre conventions. If it wasn't for these factors, I think I would enjoy Jekyll and Hyde for the same campy silliness that all of the other characters have, where they're just like weird versions of the Victorian novel they come from. Although I also think the cast was way too big to fully appreciate each of the characters. If this had ended up being a whole series of movies, then it would have been fine. As it stands, Jekyll and Hyde ends up being pretty low for me personally because there are characters with more interesting things going on. Although honestly, he has at least a more interesting storyline than Nemo. I don't know, this movie is so weird because I think I spent most of both of these videos complaining about it, but I already want to rewatch it because it was just very weird and entertaining, even where I found it to be somewhat bothersome. Also, on an unrelated note, I found out Tom Sawyer wasn't in the comics and was added to this movie specifically for American audiences, which makes it even weirder that he is a gunslinger instead of being anything like his original character. And he is so weirdly focused on, like he has a bigger storyline than Jekyll and Hyde. I don't know, I would follow this up with a deeper comparison of Tom Sawyer to the original text, but we all know that Mark Twain is my personal villain, so I don't know if I want to read it.
You stink of fear!
But yeah, either way, this version of Jekyll and Hyde, while entertaining, is going to be pretty low on our list of adaptational accuracy, even when compared to other Hulk-like Hydes. Although if you are going to veer away from the book and make Jekyll and Hyde separate characters, I do like the choice of having them talk to each other through a mirror. I thought that was really cool.
We can do it, Henry.
What are you talking about?
You know we can do it. Together.
This book might actually be the most accurate retelling of Jekyll and Hyde. Which is wild because it's obviously tonally very different and like in a completely different genre. This is a gay black romance where the original was like a gothic horror. But like I've consumed dozens of Jekyll and Hyde adaptations over the last month, and none of them come even close to the level of book accuracy that this one does. I genuinely do not believe that many people who adapt this story have even read the book. However, this author, it so clearly did. I think she read the book, thought, what if I turn this into a romance, and then immediately wrote My Dear Henry, a Jekyll and Hyde remix. And like, I'm honestly shocked at just how much of the book she was able to keep in. Now, obviously, this story is pulling from the queer reading of Jekyll and Hyde. We know in the original story, Jekyll created Hyde so that he could go and do something that was socially unacceptable to Victorian society. Many people have interpreted that thing as doing queer stuff. And I was surprised that actually wasn't really the direction that this queer retelling was going in. Instead, here, Utterson and Jekyll have a whole backstory together of them falling in love in college and then being separated because of Jekyll's father's relationship to their school. And then a while later, they both end up in London and the events of the original story unfold. And it even remains like an investigative mystery story from Utterson's perspective, trying to understand what is going on with Jekyll. And the plot is almost the exact same. Every scene that happens in the book happens here, just a little bit differently. And I cannot stress enough how rare that is. Like, even stories that are using the name Jekyll and Hyde still change what is happening. Like, the musical is entirely different. The plot is different, what the characters are doing is different. There's a lot of, like, new additions to the cast. There's just some general concepts that are retained. And the only other story so far that I've been able to find that tries to retain the original tale to the degree that this book does is the VeggieTales adaptation. And even that doesn't do it as much as this one does. The biggest change happening here is kind of turning subtext into text and giving an explanation for certain events that we don't have an explanation for. Lanyon is probably the best example of this, and you can close your ears for the next 30 seconds if you don't want to have spoilers about him. But in the original story, there is some queer-coded language going on with his character. He also dies from shock like a few days after witnessing Jekyll transform. But this author turns that queer subtext into reality and explains how he is able to die from shock days later because he already had a heart condition and was already like kind of dying. This just sped up the process because of how much stress it gave him. I'm like so impressed with how close this story was able to get to the original while still feeling like fresh and its own thing and, I don't know, not pandering. Like, it exists to tell a more specific and different perspective from Victorian society while still retaining a lot of the themes of the original. Although that being said, there were a few things that I was bothered by because they were just so close to feeling accurate to the Victorian era, but just like were barely off. Originally, one of those things for me was the way Utterson was acting. Like, he was being really jealous and I don't know, it just felt kind of weird for what was going on. But then I remembered how incredibly paranoid and just how many crazy ideas he had in the original novel, and I realized, oh, this is Utterson. Like, she actually characterized him perfectly. But I do think the way everyone else acted around queerness was just a little off. And I kind of get it because this story was written for a modern audience, and so it's not going to tell it like it would if it was written in the 1800s. But it was so close to feeling like it was that I was like, it just threw me off a little when the vibe would change to something more like presentist or anachronistic. I also thought vilifying Carew was an interesting choice. I was wondering how she was going to justify Hyde's existence because this is a romance and there's no way to tell Jekyll and Hyde as a romance without changing Hyde or changing something about the story to make Hyde like less villainous, I guess. Not that Hyde in the original story is as bad as people make him out to be, but he still, like, murdered someone. But in this, she kind of exonerates him by making Carew an evil guy, and then exonerates him even more at the end. Like, I kind of felt like that part was a little unnecessary. Like, I don't know. I do understand why it's there. I guess that's why I would rate this book really high, is because every change I understand the reason for them. They make sense. Not to mention, the exploration of queerness and blackness in Victorian England was very interesting. I actually think she could have gone a bit further with it, but was held back by how much she was staying true to the original narrative. I don't know. It is possible to make an adaptation more accurate, I guess, than this one. But if you want something that is like a fresh take on Jekyll and Hyde, but is still retelling the original story, this is probably the best one out there. And I actually would love if this got a film adaptation over the dozens of Jekyll and Hyde movie adaptations that are nothing like the original book, but are still retelling the same story about science being dangerous. Or the duality of man shown through his relationship to women when the original story was clearly had queer subtext in it. One final note on this book I want to make is the changes to Jekyll and Hyde himself. Because while I've been praising this story for how much it's actually trying to retell the original where most adaptations don't, I think one of the places where it does actually make a change is with the character of Jekyll and Hyde, which is the thing that started this whole series, honestly, trying to find a book-accurate version of the character. Because most stories really only retain him, but still change him into being, someone with DID, or, someone with some other situation going on. And here, I actually think some of the elements are a bit ambiguous, and it's treats them as if they are the same person, but at the same time, not in some ways. It does do a very good job at retaining the original vibe until the very end. And at the very, very last minute, it changed from a question of societal pressure to, personal shame almost. And I didn't dislike this idea. I found it to be pretty interesting and well done. I just was intrigued by, the direction that ended up going in. And how it is expected for a mystery romance novel, but not necessarily for a Jekyll and Hyde adaptation. But again, even this was really good, and I honestly do recommend this novel. I know most of these aren't reviews, and this one has been a lot more reviewy than they usually are. But that's because it just retained so much. So the majority of what I want to say about it is kind of spoiler free or stuff you already have spoilers on. And the thematics are very similar to the original Jekyll and Hyde story. So yeah, thank you for recommending this one because it is currently on the top of our adaptation list. Today we're going to talk about one of the more obscure Jekyll and Hyde adaptations, this children's book from Costa Rica. Thank you to Luis and Mikael for telling me about and sending me this book. So this is part of a My First Horror Story collection that retells a bunch of popular horror stories like Frankenstein, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Dracula, but with these very short, 16-page illustrated readers. And how accurate it actually is to the original text is questionable, but not as much as most of the adaptations that we've looked at. I mean, a lot of the changes are understandable. This is made for modern-day children, while the original was made for adults in the 1800s. We have the classic oversimplifying Hyde as evil and Jekyll as good. You can ignore my little translation edits that helped me read this. Hyde is also changed to be large and imposing, which is also common in adaptations, but not in the original. Other than that, though, it is actually trying to be a retelling of Jekyll and Hyde. It even has Utterson trying to find out what's happening. Kind of. I mean, it is really, really short. So a lot of the scenes are left out and a lot of the characters are left out. Basically, in this version, the thing that Hyde does in the middle of the night is be angry and aggressive towards people. One night, Utterson sees him go into Jekyll's house. Jekyll says, "Oh, he's just a patient of mine. I'm trying to help him with his anger." Then Hyde attacks Utterson with his umbrella instead of a cane, which I thought was interesting, unless it was just how it was translated. But right before Utterson were to be beaten to death by Hyde, just like he does to Carew in the book, Utterson covers his eyes and suddenly he is not murdered and Hyde is gone and Jekyll is there. Jekyll says that he's scared Hyde away. The next day, Utterson goes to Jekyll's house, but Jekyll's not there. The butler leaves him a note and says, "You're only to open this if Jekyll never returns." Utterson decides not to wait to open it and immediately does once he gets home, and the note says, kind of similar to what Jekyll's note says in the book, but again, making himself more distinctly good and evil personalities. In this case, he tried inventing a serum that would separate your good and bad side from each other, but his bad side ended up manifesting in Hyde, who he can't control. But right before Hyde was able to kill Utterson, Jekyll was able to get control again. And yes, that may sound like an abrupt explanation, especially one to end on, but this is the end of the book. I talked to my partner who, as you may know, studies child psychology, and he says this kind of book, to him, it seems to be an easy reader. A book that is intended for like 7 to 9-year-olds to read to themselves. Children who already know how to read but need something to practice with. And that's part of why the story seems to not be as tight as it could be, because they aren't always. Also, he said that he prefers when easy readers have more cohesive stories and endings than this one, but he likes the idea of giving children like a early horror story like this. I also don't think it was the worst ending in the world. It just had a lot of questions left open and explained this random incident that happened without like explaining what's going to happen now. But I do think it's a decent introduction to Jekyll and Hyde for children, especially because it is actually trying to retell like the bones of the story, at least. It even ends on a note from Jekyll to Utterson, just like the actual book does. And as always, I am impressed that it's trying to retell the book at all, because most Jekyll and Hyde adaptations are just trying to adapt the character. Very few adapt the actual story, and those that do very rarely have Utterson as the protagonist. So it's pretty cool to see that here, even though it creates some of the typical adaptational changes for Jekyll and Hyde, like making Hyde huge and pure evil while Jekyll is like pure good. I also think the art style is pretty cute. This is the first picture book version of Jekyll and Hyde that I've seen, and it might be one of the only ones out there. There was at least one typo I found where Jekyll was spelled Jekkyl, and that made me kind of question like if there were more typos in the Spanish that I just wasn't picking up on because I don't know Spanish. But it didn't seem to be that way to me. It just is interesting to have a typo in an easy reader, considering its purpose is to help children read. But again, it's just a typo in a name, so it's not like the end of the world. I'm so intrigued by some of the artistic choices and the possible cultural influences that caused it to be made the way that it was. By which I mean what is acceptable as horror for children can vary greatly. Showing Hyde actually murder someone here isn't that surprising, but why was his weapon an umbrella instead of a cane? Why were bow ties used instead of actual ties for Utterson and Jekyll? But Jekyll's butler has an actual tie and a collar turned up. And we see like a duality of colors in this scene of red/orange and purple, but why those colors? I just don't have an exact answer, but I'm intrigued by this art and want to look into the other books in the series and what may have influenced them. This was a really cool adaptation to look into, gave me a lot to think about, and was really interesting for a children's version, although there are like some issues with it as an easy reader. I would put it in the more accurate adaptations, mostly just falling short simply because it is a very short children's version. But it might be number 3 so far in terms of accuracy, right behind VeggieTales. If you would like a copy, this book unfortunately seems to be very difficult to get outside of Costa Rica. But if you know anything about this publisher or an easy way to purchase it outside of Costa Rica, please let me know, because I am very interested in learning more about this publication. and the process that went into making it. Okay, today we're gonna break the rules and talk about Fight Club. Or as Marla puts it, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Jackass.
You're Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Jackass.
Okay, so first off, I'm just gonna say Fight Club is a very artistic film. There are a lot of artistic interpretations you can take away from it, and if we went into most of them, we would be here all day. So we're gonna primarily focus on the comparative reading to Jekyll and Hyde. Although the way that I personally read Fight Club is that it's examining the crisis of masculinity that was happening in the 90s but still happening to today, where our idealized version of what it means to be masculine is no longer achievable, unless you're, someone going out and fighting people all the time. And this is problematized by late-stage capitalism, which requires a white-collar job to live happily, but the blue-collar jobs are what are idealized by this kind of masculinity. It's an examination of the existential dread that is felt by men existing in this world, and while actual human connection and self-examination could resolve that existential dread, men are socialized to deal with their problems through violence. But what do I know? Anyway, as I said, this is primarily going to be an examination of the film's connection to the original Jekyll and Hyde novel, and especially we're going to look at Marla's quote that I mentioned at the beginning. Because like many people who talk about how Fight Club is a misunderstood film, I think that quote is often misread. Now, what is Fight Club exactly for those who don't know? Obviously, major spoilers from here. Fight Club is kind of a trippy film. It's about this man who people often refer to as Jack because he quotes this I am Jack thing, but he doesn't actually have a name, and I think that's pretty important to the text. However, for simplicity's sake, we're gonna call him Jack. Even though him not having a name is integral to his seemingly subconscious desire for ego death. Anyways, Jack is depressed. He starts faking illnesses and going to support groups to try and make himself feel better, and his depression coincides with insomnia, so when he starts going to these support clubs, he starts to be less insomniatic. Enter Marla. She starts going to all of these support groups too, and the fact that she is also faking having all of these diseases is making it, again, impossible for him to sleep. Maybe because he started going to these support groups to try and fill the void of not having an identity. And because of American individualism, her doing the same thing as him threatens this new self-image. Or perhaps her being a woman threatens his new masculine identity. If a woman's also doing this can't be very manly of me. Anyways, they have a little frenemies thing happen, and then enter new character and the height of our production, Tyler Durden. Tyler is a soap salesman, although as time goes on, you realize that he is using the soap to do some criminal activity. Shortly after, Jack's apartment explodes, strangely with the same material used to make soap. How odd. Jack moves in with Tyler and they start a fight club as a way to get out their emotions, which is literally just punching each other. It gets a little more complicated than that, but there's a lot of punching. Tyler starts having sex with Marla, who is suddenly very friendly to Jack. And when he still acts cold to her, she is very confused, suspicious. Anyways, the fight club starts growing and getting bigger and seems to be morphing into something else entirely. Although worth noting, at no point are women ever allowed in. Suspicious. Anyways, eventually Jack realizes that Tyler is doing something very nefarious with this fight club and is planning to blow up a whole bunch of buildings. Specifically credit card companies, because consumerism bad. Which is also a huge theme of the movie. Jack equates himself to his furniture. Anyways, Jack goes to confront Tyler, and plot twist, they're the same person. Although not actually the same person, they are two separate identities that exist within the same body. It's very much like DID alters, which we're going to talk about in a moment. Anyways, the movie ends with Tyler and Jack having this big confrontation where Jack wins, and Jack and Marla have some kind of reconciliation right before all of the bombs go off. And we, along with Marla and Jack, watch as everything comes crumbling down. Personally, I found the movie to be very entertaining to dissect and talk about, although not particularly entertaining to watch, although that's mostly a me thing. Fight Club is very much ingrained in late 20th century American grit. It is a very distinct style of storytelling that is very physical and kind of gratuitous for the sake of making you feel a specific thing, but not to really say anything extra. Like, the movie is very artistic. There's a bunch going on, a lot of different interpretations you can take away from it. I'm mostly just saying that, like, the fight scenes are excessive. And they don't really serve, like, an additional narrative function other than the fight scenes, like, between Jack and Tyler. Like, the other fight scenes matter and they're doing something in the narrative, but it goes on for a while. They're gratuitous, although at times homoerotic, and like that's thrilling. But again, that's not really what we're here to talk about. But on to the main event. What is Fight Club's place in the Jekyll and Hyde archetype, and is it faithful to the originator of the trope? Now, for these particularly artistic movies that are very invested in having a lot of different potential interpretations, you'll see that the answer is pretty much always going to be a mixture of it being like the originator of the trope and incredibly unlike it. Like Jekyll, Jack struggles with existing within his society. He creates Tyler as a sort of alter ego, imagining him to be everything that Jack feels he can't be. Tyler is powerful, charismatic, persuasive. Most importantly, he gets what he wants. Beyond this, Tyler and Jack follow a more archetypal version of Jekyll and Hyde than the original Stevenson text. Paying comparative reading to take away from the original Jekyll and Hyde novel and the Fight Club film and novel, I guess, is that society has failed these people and that leads them to create this alternative identity. Jekyll purposefully, Jack subconsciously. There's also this level of like suicidality, although they're inverted on when that happens, with Jekyll and Hyde being near the end and Fight Club seeming to be near the beginning, especially with the way Marla talks about dying. Beyond this, Fight Club kind of expands what it means to embody this trope. And like many other stories, it does this by having the Jekyll and Hyde characters be entirely separate identities, and the Jekyll character not remember anything that's happening when the Hyde character is in control. Or at the very least, not realizing when Tyler is, because sometimes they are like co-fronting. There's also this level of duality going on here that, like Jekyll and Hyde, I think is often misread as good versus evil, whereas in both cases, it's kind of like neutral versus evil. Actually, I would say that both of the characters in Fight Club have complicated morality, although the struggle between them is very similar to Jekyll and Hyde. There's kind of this element that Tyler exists within Jack, but I think it comes across, at least to me, as a very DID situation. Jack created Tyler as a coping mechanism, but now Tyler is his own person. And before I get further into talking about that, I just want to clarify, I do not have DID, and I'm not going to make claims on how good representation is of a particular condition that I do not have, even if I know people who do. That being said, from what I've read, a lot of people with DID appreciate this movie because they feel very similarly to Jack, not necessarily in the Jekyll and Hyde sense, but more so in the confusion that he feels and like the problems with his sense of self, amnesia, the trippiness of the whole movie, his kind of escape into a headspace with the cave. All of it seems to be very DID coded, and that's pretty interesting from a story in the 90s. And the story isn't really about that. It's not examining it in any particular way. And I'll link a disability studies article about it. Although at the very least, I think it's not falling into the evil alter trope. Although I think many people do interpret it that way, but it's kind of misreading Jack as like particularly good. Jack and Tyler have conflicting desires in action, but they have very similar or the same desires in like the willingness that Tyler has to break rules is something that Jack wants. That's why Tyler exists, to cope with Jack's inability to do so, which is also a similarity to the book Jekyll and Hyde, because Jekyll wants everything that Hyde does because they're the same person, even though people often misread it. There is definitely a further discussion to be had about DID here, although I think that's part of a larger conversation that we can do at another time with more research, or at least like a deeper understanding for my part, because again, it's not something that I have, nor is it something that is like in my main field of study. I just have a general understanding of the condition from people that I know and like watching people with it discuss their experience. And I'd rather have like a better understanding than that before we get too much further into this conversation generally about Jekyll and Hyde adaptations and DID. Just know that Fight Club has a place in this conversation, and it seems to be on a more positive note, at least in terms of like accuracy or relatability, which is interesting because I think Jack's experience is meant to be relatable to a lot of people, particularly his existential dread living life as a 30-year-old. But anyways, I've identified Jack as the Jekyll character and Tyler as the Hyde character, but I think that is not always the case, and this is the most interesting part, to me at least, about Fight Club using a sort of Jekyll and Hyde archetype. And we get this from Marla when she says, "You're Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Jackass." Because to Marla, Jack is not the Dr. Jekyll. Because even though to us, the audience, Jack is the Dr. Jekyll, when Marla says this, he is not. Tyler is the Jekyll and Jack is the ass. If the movie was told from Marla's perspective, what she experiences is a man who calls her up at night and they hook up, and he seems to be like super into her and the sex is really good, etc., etc. And then in the morning, he treats her like he has no idea who she is and tells her to get the hell out. And this happens continuously, and it is very confusing to Marla. This is why she calls them Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Jackass, because Tyler is the nice Jekyll to her and Jack is the ass. And I think that alone really subverts our understanding of the movie. It adds this layer of perspective, and one that we can apply to quite a few different adaptations of Jekyll and Hyde, because the original story is told from Utterson. His view of Hyde as evil and Jekyll as good is skewed. Jekyll's description of himself is not particularly that of a good person, but it doesn't matter because we are watching the events through Utterson's eyes. And like to us watching this movie, Tyler is obviously an asshole, and Jack seems to be a relatively normal guy and even tries to stop Tyler. But this is not the view of them that Marla gets to see. And that's just like so interesting. The whole world is going to view them differently than they might view each other or themselves. There's like this added element of identity that is not just internal but also external. Something that I think films that focus really heavily on American individualism, kind of like Fight Club, tend to lack. So having this in here was really exciting. Even if it's just a small line, but it's telling of a larger situation that's happening. Anyway, there's so much more that we can say about Fight Club, but in regards to its examination of this duality, I think it's very interesting. Take with that what you will. Also, I hope you enjoyed my new tripod and my Fight Club outfit. So I've been watching and discussing Jekyll and Hyde adaptations for the last month or so. And there's still a lot that I've seen that I haven't got a chance to make a video on yet. But tonight at 7 Eastern Standard Time, my Film Talk friend Bueller and I are going to go live on TikTok to discuss the book further. So feel free to join us if you want to be part of that conversation or just hear us talk about it.